Before we begin our journey into forgotten tales and strange divinities, take a deep breath and allow your body to settle. Here at Medieval Nocturnes, we guide you through stories that drift like fog over old marble and flicker like flame in a cold room. If you enjoy quiet histories wrapped in myth and moonlight, consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. You're not just joining a channel, you're entering a sanctuary of ancient whispers. Now, dim the lights, set your mind adrift, and let the gods speak softly as we begin. Long before temples echoed with chants or statues were chiseled into perfection, there were stories, not just of Zeus and his thunderbolts, or Aphrodite and her beauty, but stranger ones, quieter, older, less polished by poets and priests, stories that wandered through the cracks of legend, wild, unsettling, and often forgotten. These were the myths that didn't make it into the golden pantheon, yet lived on in the shadows of marble columns and the silence between prayers. They weren't heroic epics or grand wars, but instead tales of cursed lovers, shape-shifting gods, dreams turned to stone, and music that unspooled time. One such tale begins not in Olympus, but in a forge, deep in the coastal village of Mythical, where the sea hissed against black rocks and the sky hung low with soot. There lived a blacksmith named Callista. Unlike the soft-handed nobility, she knew only fire, steel, and the sound of her hammer striking bronze. Her skin was scarred, her arms strong, and her gaze unflinching. Legends said she once forged armor so seamless that Ares himself wore it into battle, though he never admitted it aloud. But Callista did not seek divine approval. She shaped iron not for gods, but to keep men alive. One night, as the forge hissed and the moon hovered crimson over the Aegean, a shadow entered her workshop, not creeping, but calm, as if it had always belonged. It was Hephaestus, the god of the forge, the crippled son of Hera, the outcast of Olympus. He did not speak, he simply watched. His eyes, like glowing coals, followed her every movement, not with lust, but recognition. In Callista's rhythm, in her sweat, in the fire that clung to her skin, he saw a reflection of something divine. There were no vows exchanged, no celestial light. But the forge burned hotter that night, and 9 months later, Callista gave birth to a boy. She named him Irion. He did not cry when he was born. Instead, the fire in the hearth flared as if greeting its kin. His eyes shimmered like molten iron, and when the midwife touched his skin, she pulled her hand back, whispering, "He's touched by something not meant to stay." Irion grew fast. At 5, he could mold bronze. At 7, he forged a blade that never dulled. The village kept its distance. He did not lie, he did not laugh. His silence was not cold, but ancient, and that frightened people. Some called him cursed. Others whispered demigod behind cupped hands. But Callista never wavered. She taught him that fire obeys those who listen, not those who command. As his strength grew, so did something else, a restlessness. He began to dream of flames beyond his forge. Not destructive ones, but sacred fire, the kind Prometheus once stole to gift humanity. That fire, now hidden away on Olympus, had long grown dim. Hearths flickered, winters stretched endlessly, and frost claimed even summer nights. But in his dreams, Irion saw warmth returning. And so, the story of Irion begins, not with conquest, but with yearning, with a quiet fire smoldering in a forgotten corner of the world, ready to reclaim the light the gods had once withheld. The world had grown colder, not in the way that frost creeps over rooftops in winter, but in the slow, bone-deep stillness that made fire a memory rather than a comfort. In villages far beyond Myini, priests blamed the stars. Scholars drew trembling constellations across crumbling parchment, trying to explain why the hearths would no longer burn like they once did. Children huddled under blankets that no longer warmed. Elderly hands shook over ashes that whispered of punishment. But in truth, the gods had simply turned away. Long ago, the eternal flame had been gifted to man, not as a gesture of mercy, but of rebellion. Prometheus had defied Olympus, stolen the divine spark, and gifted it to mortals so they could think, create, and imagine. It was a fire of progress, not destruction. But as centuries passed, humanity forgot. The gift became a tool. The tool became mundane. The reverence faded. And so the gods, shrouded in pride and bitterness, locked the flame away again. High atop Olympus, guarded by white marble halls and divine indifference, the last spark flickered in a brazier never meant for mortal eyes. It had not been touched by human hands in generations. No god dared share it. They feared another Prometheus, another fall from grace. Let them suffer, they murmured to one another. Let them remember who gave them fire. But not all gods agreed. In hidden places, where mountain streams whispered to oaks, where dryads listened to the shifting winds, stories began to spread. Of a boy whose breath stoked dying embers, of forges that burned brighter when he passed, of flames that danced in his shadow. Nymphs saw sparks in his footsteps. In Delos, the oracle began to tremble in her sleep, muttering prophecies of fire walking on two legs. Orion knew none of this. He only knew the iron was becoming harder to shape, that the fire in his forge no longer obeyed as it once had, that the world around him felt thinner, like breath held too long. But the world had noticed him. Gods who had remained silent for centuries began to turn their gaze toward Myini. The divine brazier on Olympus, untouched and hidden, flickered for the first time in ages, not for a god, but for a boy. And far away, on the slopes of dying Delos, where temples crumbled and sacred springs had long dried to mist, a vision stirred. The oracle of Delos awoke in darkness, eyes wide, her lips cracked, her voice hoarse from decades of silence. The wind howled through the ruins, and yet, in her mind, one name burned like a forge newly stoked, Irian. And so, fate began to gather kindling, and the world, weary, cold, and forgotten, prepared to be set alight once more. Delos had once been the heartbeat of prophecy. Kings and warriors once climbed its winding paths, desperate to hear Apollo's whispers echo from ancient stone. Now it was barely more than a memory. Vines choked the marble steps. The sacred spring gurgled into silence. Temples crumbled, and statues of gods stared blind and forgotten into the wind. But in the hollows of its last temple, someone still waited, a voice that had not yet surrendered to dust. Orion's journey there was quiet. He did not come with offerings or ask for guidance. He came because something inside him, something older than his bones, pulled him toward the silence. The air was heavy when he arrived, thick with something more than age. Not dust, not rot, memory. A memory that waited for its name to be spoken aloud. He stepped beneath the broken arch of the temple alone. The torches were long dead, the shadows long grown. Ivy clung to altars like forgotten fingers. No one greeted him, no bells, no voices, only wind and the hum of something watching. Down, deeper, he descended into the mountain's breath, where the oracle still sat, draped in violet robes, skin pale and thin as old ash, eyes blind yet burning with a storm that never passed. She inhaled sharply the moment he stepped into the chamber, like a dying ember catching wind. "Yan," she hissed, though he had not spoken his name. Her voice cracked like lightning, echoing across the stone. He said nothing. "You will climb the mountain, you will take the flame, and you will die." The prophecy struck like iron. It was not wrapped in riddles or softened with poetry. It was a sentence, a truth already unfolding. Ian didn't flinch. He had expected something more, some divine plea, some hope, but all she gave him was certainty. The oracle rose. Her movements were brittle, like smoke in a draught. "The gods will oppose you. The world will demand your failure. The flame is not for mortals. It was stolen once, and the price was eternity in chains." He stepped forward, fists clenched, voice low but steady. "Then let me pay the price." For a long moment she said nothing. Then laughter, not cruel, not mocking, but the weary laugh of someone who had seen too many stories end the same way. "You already are," she whispered. The thunder outside surged. The walls groaned. The air thickened with old magic, and just as suddenly all went still. The oracle slumped back onto her throne. Her mouth opened once more, but only smoke escaped. The prophecy was finished. Yet it would follow Irian like a second shadow, in dreams, in firelight, in every glint of steel on his anvil. The gods had spoken. His path had been lit. But no god, no oracle, not even Olympus itself, could predict what a world starved of fire would do when warmth was offered again. To reach Olympus, Irian would first have to descend, not in metaphor, but in truth. Legends said that before one could ascend the sacred mountain, they had to pass through the oldest gate beneath its roots, a threshold not marked by stone, but by soul. It was here that Cerberus, the great three-headed hound of Hades, guarded not the way to death, but the memory of it. No one could pass without touching oblivion. Irian did not hesitate. He knew the myth. He had studied it, not as a child studies bedtime stories, but as a blacksmith studies flame. Every part of him had been forged in the rhythm of iron and fire. And so he prepared not with armor, but with craftsmanship. For 3 days and nights he shaped a collar from obsidian and iron, fusing it with the final ember from his mother's forge. Into its band he carved 3 names, not spells, not commands, but memories, memory, loyalty, grief, one for each of Cerberus' heads. On the 4th day, he arrived at the mouth of the cave. The air here didn't sting the skin, it scraped the soul. It smelled not of rot, but of forgotten prayers. Bones lined the edges of the descent, faintly glowing, half swallowed by darkness. He went down, past torchless corridors that lit themselves, down where the silence pulsed with breath that wasn't his. Then he heard it, the breathing, slow, massive, rhythmic, like 3 separate storms, dreaming in unison. Cerberus. The clearing opened like a wound. There he was, the hound of the underworld. 3 heads resting atop a mound of ash and bone, each snout twitching in different rhythms. Its fur was darker than absence, and though its eyes were closed, its ears moved. It was not asleep, it was waiting. Irian approached, not as a hero, but as a child of fire and reverence. He knelt, held out the collar, and then, softly, like the hum of bellows, began to sing. It was a song his mother had once whispered to him during thunderous nights when the wind clawed at the shutters. A lullaby meant to soothe the fire within, simple, gentle, unshaped by war. One of the heads stirred, the other opened an amber eye. The third let out a low growl, then quieted. In that silence, Irion slipped the collar on Cerberus, exhaled. A gust like the closing of a gate, and behind him the path opened, not with rage, not with violence, but with respect. Irion had touched death, and death had chosen to step aside. The road up Olympus was no road at all. No carved steps, no sacred columns to guide the way. Only wind, rock, and the hum of something ancient watching from behind the clouds. It was not a place mortals climbed. It was a place the gods believed could not be reached unless summoned. But Irion did not wait for permission. His hands bled on jagged stone. His breath came in short bursts of steam. The mountain resisted him with every inch, stone shifting, wind howling in forgotten tongues. This wasn't nature. It was Olympus itself, sentient and displeased. But still he climbed, not with arrogance, but with purpose. Then, in the silence between gusts, a presence emerged, not with thunder, not with glowing light, but quietly, standing on a ledge just ahead. A man in a loose cloak, feathered sandals, laced up bare calves, and a coin spinning idly between long fingers. Hermes, messenger, trickster, thief of boundaries. Well, Hermes said, as the coin danced across his knuckles, I thought you'd be taller. Irion didn't stop. Hermes matched his pace without ever seeming to move. I know why you're here, he continued, eyes sharp and amused. You want to bring fire back to mortals, sweet, noble, stupid. Irion's steps slowed, then stopped me. Hermes laughed, not mockingly, something stranger, as though entertained by a child pushing through a storm. Stop you? Oh no, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to deliver terms. His grin faded slightly. You're walking into a story that isn't yours, into a vault where the gods keep their biggest mistake. Irion kept climbing. The flame, Hermes said, suddenly more serious, wasn't hidden because it's precious. It was hidden because it's dangerous. The gods fear it not because it warms, but because it awakens. Irion turned to him. Then they've forgotten what danger looks like. For the first time, Hermes didn't smile. His wings shifted, feathers rustling like blades drawn. The coin vanished. He stepped forward and pressed 2 fingers to Irion's chest. Then take this gift, he whispered. Pain lanced through Irion, not pain of flesh, but of soul. A thread deep within him twisted. It was like fire igniting behind his eyes. But it didn't burn, it rewrote. The fire you seek, Hermes said, low and close, will burn everything you are. Then he was gone. The sky darkened. The wind fell still. A storm was beginning, not of rain, but of consequence. And Ion, marked and cursed, kept climbing. The curse Hermes left behind settled into Irion's chest like cold iron pressed against bare skin. At first, it was subtle, a heaviness in his breath, a strange flicker of heat beneath his ribs. But with every step he took upward, that ember began to smolder. It was not the kind of fire that warmed. It was the kind that scoured. As he climbed, the mountain no longer simply resisted. It began to fight him. The air grew thinner, sharper, biting at his skin. The stone beneath his hands shifted in unnatural ways, slick with mist that wasn't wet. Whispers rode the wind, old voices murmuring in tongues lost before men had learned to write. Olympus revealed itself not as a place of glory, but a place of trial. Trees gave way to sheer cliffs. Stars above seemed to pull farther back, as though even they refused to witness what came next. The silence grew oppressive, not quiet, but full of absence. Birds did not fly here. Even the breeze hesitated. Irian climbed with bloodied palms and torn skin, muscles screaming with effort. But still, he moved upward, driven not by ambition, but by memory. He saw flashes of his mother's forge, the warmth of her calloused hands, the quiet strength she carried when the world had nothing left to give. And he thought of the villages below, of children sleeping cold, of families huddled around dying embers, of humanity forgetting the very thing that had once separated them from the beasts, fire. Lightning began to gather on the ridge, not in strikes, but in pulses, as though the gods themselves paced just beyond the veil, waiting for him to break. The storm was not of rain, but of reckoning. Irian could feel their gaze, the weight of divine judgment pressing down. But something else began to shift in him too. The flame Hermes had cursed into his soul now beat in rhythm with his heart. It didn't consume, not yet, but it reminded, it whispered, of purpose, of defiance, of the cost that must be paid to bring warmth back to a world gone cold. And through the shadows of cloud and stone, he saw it, not the summit, but something older. The ruins of temples long forgotten, their altars cracked, their statues half swallowed by time. Athena's gaze, once proud, now chipped and blind. Zeus's likeness, split down the middle, as though cleaved by silence. These were not shrines anymore, they were graves. Graves for gods who no longer heard prayers, and who had left behind only stone echoes of what they once were. And as Irian passed through their ruins, he began to understand something no mortal had dared speak aloud in centuries. The gods weren't powerful anymore, they were afraid. Fear had crept into Olympus, not in screams or war cries, but in silence. The kind of silence that settles after something ancient has shifted. Irian could feel it in the stones beneath his feet, in the way the mountain groaned under his presence. The gods, once worshipped through blood and marble, no longer roared with dominance. They whispered behind clouds, hoping the boy would fail. For, if he succeeded, it would mean something unthinkable, that a mortal could reclaim the divine, not through birthright, but through will. The wind tore through a narrow pass as Irian pulled himself higher, now half carved by storm and pain. His body was unraveling, not from injury, but transformation. The fire Hermes had planted was no longer an ember. It pulsed through his veins, pushing back against his mortal frame. His skin flushed with heat, not from exertion, but from something far more elemental waking inside. He coughed, and smoke curled from his lips. It hurt, but not like wounding, more like being rewritten. Every step forward stripped away who he had been and forged something new, something the gods had tried to bury long ago. Above him, a flicker of light cut through the clouds. Not lightning, not sun, flame. The summit was near. The divine brazier, unseen by mortal eyes for an age, called to him, not with temptation, but recognition. It was not guarded by spears or thunder or sentinels of Olympus, because it had never needed protection from mortals, until now. Irian crested the final rise, legs trembling, lungs burning with every breath, and stepped into a clearing where the air stood still, as though time itself had paused to watch. There, in the center of the summit, stood the brazier. It was older than the mountain, forged before language, shaped by hands whose names were lost even to the gods. It did not flicker like a normal fire. It blazed white, pure, constant, alive. The pedestal on which it stood was blackened stone, cracked with age and divine heat. And the moment Irian saw it, The curse Hermes had given him surged. His heart felt torn open, his breath caught. But the pain didn't push him back. It pulled him closer. He stepped forward. The flame did not recoil. It did not lash out. Instead, it leaned toward him, as if sensing something familiar. His hands trembled as he reached out. And then, in that moment between hesitation and contact, he saw everything. Cities built from firelight. Generations warmed by hearth and forge. The laughter of children beside glowing embers. And the slow fading of all of it as the gods turned away. Irion did not hesitate. He grabbed the flame. The moment Irion's hands touched the eternal flame, the world changed. Not in thunder or divine fury, but in stillness. A stillness so absolute it pressed into the bones. Time seemed to bend inward. The clouds froze. Even the wind, ever restless along the high ridges of Olympus, hushed in reverence. The fire did not burn him, not at first. Instead, it entered him, like a breath returned after years under water. His skin shimmered, veins glowing faintly like cracks in cooled obsidian. His spine arched as the flame poured into him, not a blaze, but a transformation. He was no longer holding it, he was becoming it. The divine brazier, which had guarded the flame for eons, flickered once, dimmed, then went cold. The light that had once separated gods from mortals now lived within a boy, born of forge and sorrow. Irion collapsed beside the pedestal, smoke rising from his fingertips. He did not scream. He had no voice left. His eyes glowed like sunrise. Each breath he took sent tiny waves of warmth through the air, down the mountain, toward the frozen world below. But it wasn't victory. It was sacrifice. Irion had taken the fire, yes, but not for glory. He did not seek temples or songs. He had taken it because the world had forgotten how to be warm, how to gather, how to live. He had not stolen it. He had offered himself to it. And now, as the last embers of Olympus cooled behind him, he began the descent, not as a blacksmith, not as a son of gods, but as something entirely new, a vessel of divine fire. The mountain, once hostile, now shifted beneath his feet to guide him. The clouds parted with quiet deference. Even the stones, once cold, now warmed beneath his steps. He descended not like a hero returning from conquest, but like a flame passing through frost. Wherever his footsteps landed, the air softened, the wind gentled, frost turned to dew. The eternal flame had chosen to walk the world again, not in defiance, but in renewal. But Irion was not unchanged. His limbs trembled beneath the weight of what he carried. His form flickered between flesh and light. The fire was not just warmth, it was memory. It remembered every spark that had ever been struck, every torch, every forge, every funeral pyre. And now, all of that remembrance lived inside him. He saw Troy's burning towers. He heard the songs sung by sailors beside lanterns. He felt the comfort of a single match lit in a freezing room. And he saw the cost. Fire had built empires, but it had also destroyed them. It had been a tool of creation and a weapon of vengeance. Prometheus had been punished not for giving it, but for showing mortals what they could become with it. And now Irion, bearing that same gift, walked with the weight of every spark the world had ever known. Irion walked down Olympus, not with triumph, but with burden. Every step was measured, not by distance, but by memory, not his own, but those of the flame that now burned inside him. It was not just light he carried, but stories. The fire knew every hand that had ever held it, every tear it had illuminated, every shadow it had cast away. And as it pulsed within him, Irian understood that he was no longer a boy. He was a witness, a bearer of something ancient and wild, something that had once belonged only to gods. The world responded to him. Ice melted at his approach. Hearths, long cold and choked with ash, flickered awake as he passed nearby. In a village tucked beneath a frozen cliff, people emerged from their homes and watched in awe as the young man walked through their midst without speaking. He raised a single hand, and from his fingertips a wisp of flame drifted gently into the nearest hearth. It caught instantly, not violently, but as if the fire had only been sleeping, waiting for its cue. One by one, fires roared to life, not from wood or oil, but from memory. He was not hailed or praised. People stood in silence, unsure whether to kneel or weep. There was no thunderous welcome, no trumpet of divine return, only warmth, real warmth, the kind that made old men remember youth and children believe the dark could be tamed again. Irian moved like a shadow. His hair shimmered like molten metal. His skin cracked faintly with heat, as if forged anew. He was dying, and he knew it, not from wounds, but from change. The fire had claimed him completely. He could no longer sleep. He could no longer eat. He no longer needed to. The fire sustained him, but it also consumed him, not with violence, but with transformation. He was no longer a man in the way others were. He had become what the gods had feared, a mortal who had carried the divine and survived. And yet, he did not rage. He did not declare war on Olympus. He did not call down storms. Instead, he walked. He passed the cave where Cerberus had once stood watch. The gate was open now, and the hound was gone, not slain, but silent, as if even death understood that something had changed. The boundary between gods and mortals had been crossed, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. Irian reached the edge of the world, where winter still gripped the bones of villages and people warmed their hands over empty stoves. There, he offered no speech. He simply extended his hand, and the fire leaped from his palm into the cold. And in that moment, the world began to glow again. There was no monument built for Irian. No temple rose in his honor. No hymns were chanted in marble halls, and no scrolls recorded the full breadth of what he had done. And yet, he never vanished. After the flames returned, strange things began to stir across the land. In remote villages untouched by travelers, hearths would light themselves without kindling. Entire forests, once frozen solid by years of bitter frost, would bloom overnight. Blacksmiths swore their forges roared higher when no coal had been added, and children, huddled in the cold, whispered to their parents of a glowing man standing quietly by the fire before disappearing like smoke. None could prove it, but none denied it. The same story spread like a warm breath across winter air. He had walked until there was nothing left of him to walk with. His body, once flesh and fire, had fractured into something else, not death, not disappearance, a giving. His bones had melted into ember. His breath had turned to wind. His voice had become the crackle of flame. He was not mourned because nothing about him had truly been lost. He had not been extinguished. He had become something eternal, warmth, shared freely, without prayer or price. Callista's forge, where the first spark of his story was kindled, remained untouched for decades. The villagers had long since abandoned it, fearing what it represented. But one night, a traveler, wet from rain and searching for shelter, swore he saw a boy inside, not hammering iron, hammering light. The glow from the forge that night rose higher than the chimney could hold. When the traveler returned with others, the forge was empty, cold, save for a single ember that never went out, no matter how many nights passed. They say Olympus felt it, not in anger, but in silence, as if the gods, stripped of their flame and their place, could do nothing but watch, and they did not retaliate. There were no curses, no storms hurled down in divine wrath, because even they understood Ion had not taken the fire in defiance. He had taken it in purpose. In reminder, he had done what none of them dared. He gave it back. And so the eternal flame, once hidden away in the halls of immortality, now danced in every corner of the world. In the quiet soup shared between strangers, in the trembling candle held at a funeral, in the torch lifted by rebels when the world grew too dark. It no longer belonged to Olympus. It belonged to everyone, and always, always, they whispered the same name. In the land of Sparta, where boys were taught to wield a spear before they could write their names, and where glory was measured by blood spilled in silence, women were no less fierce. Among them was one whose name echoed through halls, not with song, but steel, Leonthe, daughter of Commander Adrastos. She was born under a red eclipse, a night so strange even the city's wolves howled without cause. Midwives whispered she was born of Ares himself. By 12, she could unseat grown men in the wrestling pits. By 16, she returned from the Tethys Mountains with 3 wild boars strapped to her chariot. Spartans feared her more than they praised her. She walked the agora in silence, eyes forward, back straight. Men lowered their gazes. Women watched with a mixture of envy and reverence. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words cut with precision, measured, clean, final. She was a soldier, forged not by warmth, but by duty. And yet, beneath the bronze armor and quiet discipline, something else flickered. On nights when her blade rested and the torches of Sparta burned low, Leonthe would stare at the stars, not with defiance, but with wonder. There was something in her she had no name for. It wasn't yearning for a husband or longing for conquest. It was a hunger for magic, for the mysterious, for something the Spartan code had never taught her to chase. Every full moon, as the city hushed and warriors slept, her feet took her beyond the walls, toward the cliffs above the river Eurotas. She left behind her spear, her cuirass, her name, and in those moonlit hours she became only Leonthe, a woman beneath the sky, barefoot in the grass, quiet in a world too loud to understand what she needed. It was on one of those nights, when the sky was so silver it looked like the blade of a god, that she saw it, a swan, perfectly still, gliding across the black water of a hidden grove. Its feathers shimmered, not white, but opalescent, like starlight twisted into silk. The grove was unlike anything Leonthe had known in Sparta, tucked between cliffs and hidden by tangled olive trees. It felt untouched by time, as though the gods themselves had forgotten it. The branches bowed low, forming arches that hummed softly in the breeze, silvered by moonlight that seemed to fall heavier here than anywhere else. At its center lay a still, glassy lake, no larger than a training ring, with not a ripple to disturb its surface. The swan floated alone. It moved without disturbing the water, without sound. It didn't flap or preen or blink. It simply watched her, head tilted, feathers gleaming like they'd been dipped in the last light of day. Its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They held something deeper, calmer, older. There was no fear in them, only awareness. Leanthe's training screamed at her to keep her distance. No creature moved like this. No wild thing stared without challenge or retreat. And yet she stepped forward, drawn not by reason, but by instinct. She paused at the water's edge, one hand brushing the hilt of the knife strapped to her thigh, not as a threat, but out of habit. The swan glided toward her, slow, deliberate. It reached the shallows and stopped. Then, with the grace of a dancer, it dipped its head, a bow, a gesture so subtle and human, it stole Leanthe's breath. She knelt without thinking. Her knees touched the earth softly. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they approached the creature's feathers. When they made contact, her breath caught. The swan was warm, unnaturally so, like touching sunlight made solid. Not heat from within, but heat that pulsed outward in waves of calm. Something shifted in her chest, not fear, not fascination, something far older, a recognition of something she didn't know she'd lost. For a moment, everything else, Sparta, the war drills, her father's expectations, fell away. All that remained was stillness, and the quiet knowing in the swan's gaze. Then, just as silently, it turned and drifted back to the center of the lake. Leanthe remained where she was, hands in her lap, eyes following its every move. She didn't know what had happened, only that something had begun. When the moon slipped lower and the grove began to dim, she finally stood. She walked back to Sparta, barefoot and silent, not knowing that she would return to that hidden grove every full moon. Again and again, drawn by a presence that asked nothing but gave everything. Each full moon thereafter, Leanthe returned to the hidden grove without question. It became a ritual, not one taught in Spartan temples, but one whispered in the marrow of her bones. The swan was always there, gliding silently across the moon-dappled lake, waiting as though time bent itself to their meetings. She brought no weapons, no armor, only herself, and the quiet need to be near something that made her feel more than duty. Seasons changed. The war drums beat on below the hills. Spartan boys were tested by blade and hunger, yet the grove remained untouched, as if sealed off from the ambitions of men. Here, time forgot to move. Leanthe began bringing small gifts, offerings not of conquest, but of care. Figs from her father's garden, a swatch of linen folded into a swan, carved olive wood tokens shaped by her own calloused hands. The swan never took the gifts, never even looked at them, but she left them anyway, not expecting response. The offering, she realized, wasn't for the swan. It was for the ache in her own chest, the one that dulled whenever she sat at the edge of the lake and whispered her thoughts aloud to the stillness. Over time, she began to speak. At first, it was hesitant, short observations, stories from the barracks, memories of childhood hunts. But slowly, her voice grew steady. She spoke of her father's silence, of how victories never seemed to satisfy the hollow inside her, of dreams she didn't understand, of moments when the sky seemed to weep even when she couldn't. The swan never responded, but it listened. She could feel it, the way it tilted its head, the way it drifted closer when her voice cracked. She no longer felt alone. She started braiding her hair before each visit, smoothing her robe, polishing the knife she no longer brought for protection. She began measuring time, not in campaigns or sunrises, but in moonlight. Each visit left her a little more unraveled and a little more whole. Sometimes the swan circled her in slow arcs. Other times it stood beside her on the shore, feathers barely brushing her arm. Its warmth filled the space between them, softening the air like the last breath before sleep. And though it never spoke, its presence hummed with meaning. It asked nothing, promised nothing, and yet gave her a sense of being seen in a way no Spartan ever had. Leonthe never said the word aloud, not even to herself. But it grew inside her nonetheless, something ancient, delicate, dangerous. A truth born not from battle or blood, but from silence shared beneath a sky that never looked away. She loved it. The swan was no ordinary creature. That much had become clear to Leonthe, even in the early days. But she never asked what it was. She didn't need to. She didn't care if it was divine, enchanted, or cursed. It simply was. Its presence soothed something too deep for words, too old for prayer. She only knew it came with the moon and stayed until dawn. Never late, never absent, never changing. What she couldn't know, what no mortal could suspect, was that the swan had once been a god. Apollo, god of light, of music, of prophecy, had not always moved in silence. Ages ago, he had stood in marble halls with golden robes and sun-warmed skin. But he had defied Zeus, not with a spear, not with rebellion, but with words. He had questioned the punishments handed to mortals. He had spoken against cruelty. He had asked for mercy. For that, Zeus did not destroy him. He erased him. Apollo was cursed into a swan's body, forced to drift between lakes and lifetimes, silent, watching the world forget his name. His temples crumbled. His songs faded. He became a story only bards remembered, and even then, only the bright parts. The curse was precise. If any mortal ever discovered his true identity, the transformation would become permanent. Apollo would never return to the skies. He would be feather and silence forever. And then came Leonthe. He hadn't meant to be seen, but she returned again and again. Her voice stirred something in him that even Olympus had grown too cold to recall hope. She didn't seek his power or fear his silence. She treated him not as a god, but as something sacred, something worth waiting for. He began to love her in return, not loudly, but in the way the sun loves the earth, distant, steady, always present. But he dared not speak, dared not shimmer with divine light. To reveal himself would destroy them both. In the city below, Sparta began to notice her absence, her quiet slipping away each full moon. At first, no one questioned it. Leonthe was a warrior, respected, untouchable. But over time, whispers bloomed. She spoke less in council. Her strikes lacked venom. She smiled without cause. Her father, Commander Adrastos, noticed, a man of rigid pride. He summoned her, demanding to know where her thoughts wandered. She said nothing. He warned her not to forget who she was. But the truth was simple. She already had. Sparta was a city that revered silence, the controlled kind, not the dreamy stillness Leonthe now carried. Her withdrawal unsettled those around her. Warriors began watching her more closely. She no longer fought with her usual ferocity. Her eyes drifted skyward too often. She smiled too easily, too softly. Sparta thrived on control, and whatever was blooming within her was not something they had taught her to feel. One night, a patrol followed her. They trailed her past the olive groves, staying hidden in the shadows. But near the cliffs, she vanished like mist. She had learned how to disappear, not as a soldier, but as a woman who no longer belonged to the world of blades and barked commands. Back in the grove, everything was unchanged. The trees bowed, the lake held its silver stillness, and the swan waited, as always. This time, though, its eyes were sharper, its posture more alert. It circled her in a tighter arc, wings twitching in small motions that betrayed unease. Leonthe felt it too. Something in the air had shifted, a tension like string drawn taut. She dreamed that night of feathers falling like gold dust, of a statue with wings, half man, half beast, crumbling under her touch, of a voice that echoed from her own bones, calling a name she didn't remember learning. Apollo. She awoke, breathless. The name burned behind her eyes. She tried to dismiss it, a dream, no more. But the ache in her chest told a different story. She could feel the name curling beneath her ribs, begging to be spoken aloud. The next day, she walked deeper into the hills than ever before, past known paths, through tangled groves where light moved like smoke. There, hidden beneath ivy and moss, she found an altar, ancient, weather-worn, and carved with a single word in flaking gold. Apollon. Everything inside her stilled. The pieces began to fall into place. The warmth, the listening eyes, the dreams. He hadn't been enchanted. He had been hiding. She turned slowly. The swan stood behind her, silent, still, not gliding, not graceful, just watching. And she knew the truth had arrived. And so had the end. The grove, once a sanctuary, now thrummed with something unfamiliar, tension wrapped in stillness. The moonlight, always soft and silvery, now shimmered like a blade. The air pressed against her skin like breath held too long. Trees leaned inward, silent witnesses to a secret cracking open. Leonthe faced the swan with the altar at her back. She didn't speak, not at first. The truth was already there, hanging in the air between them, humming in her chest, echoing in her veins. Finally, in a whisper, as fragile as morning frost, she said, "I know." The swan didn't move, but something in the grove exhaled, a breath that had waited centuries to be released. A single feather drifted from the swan's back, glowing faintly as it fell. It touched the altar and vanished into ash. Then it began. The swan's form shuddered, its neck arched, not in elegance, but agony. Wings stretched, cracked, twisted, feathers unraveled into golden strands of light. Webbed feet split into toes that dug into the soil. Flesh bloomed where down had been, and, in the place of the swan, a man knelt, radiant, broken, and divine. Apollo. His hair shimmered like dawn on still water. His skin glowed faintly, pulsing with the last embers of godhood. But his eyes were dimmed with sorrow, wide with farewell. Leonthe took a step back, her hand over her mouth. The man she had loved in silence was no longer a mystery. He was a myth, and the price of knowing was already being paid. He opened his mouth to speak. At first, no sound came. Then, low and raw, he rasped, "You weren't supposed to know." His voice cracked like thunder inside a cave. She fell to her knees beside him. "I didn't mean to," she said, voice trembling. Apollo smiled, soft, sad, inevitable. "I know." And the earth began to tremble. There was no lightning, no wrath, only stillness folding in on itself. The curse had been triggered. The transformation was ending. His glow faded. His limbs stiffened. Marble crept across his skin like frost chasing sunlight. His divine body began turning to stone, inch by inch. Leonthe clutched his hands. "Please," she begged, "please don't go." But gods don't break curses. They fulfill them. His fingers curled around hers one last time before they froze. His chest rose once, then fell forever. His wings, still half-formed, still beautiful, were caught in mid-motion. His gaze locked forward, no longer seeing. Apollo, the god who once sang the sun awake, had become a statue of silence, and Leonthe could only kneel beside him. As the wind carried away her voice, the transformation ended not with a crack or flash, but with silence so deep it made the heart ache. Leonthe sat motionless beside the statue, her forehead pressed against the stone hand that only moments ago had been warm with life. She didn't cry out, didn't call to the heavens. There was no point. The gods had already passed their judgment, swift, cold, and final. Her tears fell without sound, sliding down the marble fingers of the one she loved. The same fingers that had once touched the stars, now frozen in farewell. Around her, the grove dimmed. Even the moon, ever watchful in their meetings, seemed to pull back behind a veil of cloud. No storm broke, no divine rage descended, because justice in Olympus's eyes had been served. She stayed long after his body became stone, long after the birds stopped singing and the night folded in. There were no Spartans to see her weep, no comrades to offer distraction. There was only her and the statue of a god who had once been a swan, and a silence that swallowed everything that had once felt sacred. Leonthe never returned to Sparta. She left behind her armor and title, her sword, and the name her father had etched into stone. She shed them like skin. The woman who had once been commander's daughter, who had been feared in war councils, now belonged to no world except this grove. Each full moon she returned to him. She brought no offerings, no prayers, just herself. She would sit beside him, brushing her fingers along the cold outline of his jaw, sometimes humming tunes that had no beginning or end. Sometimes she whispered memories into the night. Other times she simply sat, present, breathing, alone but not lost. The villagers nearby began to whisper. They said a woman haunted the cliffs, that she wandered by moonlight with eyes like distant stars. Some said she was a priestess, others a madwoman, but none dared follow. Those who tried lost their way in the olive groves, or found themselves gripped by dreams they didn't understand. Years passed, winters came and went, empires shifted, and gods grew quieter. But Leonthe remained. She aged, but not as others did. Her strength endured, not like a warrior's, but like an ancient olive tree, roots sunk deep into sacred soil. And always the statue stood. Apollo caught Midridge, his wings still not fully formed, his eyes still open, fixed on the place where Leonthe always sat, a moment trapped in marble, untouched by time. Some travelers claimed that the statue of Apollo was warm to the touch, not hot, not glowing, but faintly warm, like sunlit stone. A few dared to place their palms against his chest and swore they felt something deep within, like the faintest echo of a heartbeat. None stayed long. The grove held an ancient stillness that turned boldness into humility. Those who wandered in left quieter, slower, as if they had walked through someone's memory. Leonthe continued to come, full moon after full moon. Her body aged as the years passed, but her movements remained steady. She no longer resembled the sharpened Spartan warrior who once carved fear into men's hearts. Her hair grayed, her shoulders softened, but her presence remained unshaken. She didn't need armor anymore. She was something stronger, the keeper of a secret love the gods had tried to erase. When she sat beside Apollo, she didn't speak every time. Some nights, she simply leaned her shoulder against his, as she once did with the swan, letting the silence fill the space between what had been and what would never be again. And even in that stillness, something alive lingered between them. something that made the wind soften and the moon linger just a little longer in the sky. The villagers never touched the statue. They built no temple, held no ceremony, but the story spread of a goddess turned woman or a warrior turned muse, depending on who told it, of a god frozen in time by love, and the mortal who waited for him long after the stars stopped watching. They became legend, not in songs or scriptures, but in quiet stories told to children before sleep. And then, one final moonlit night, Leonthe came as she always had. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She leaned gently against his side, her head resting on his marble shoulder, and she never moved again. When the villagers arrived days later, they found her there, still, peaceful, her face softened by a faint smile. No grief, no fear, just stillness. The statue hadn't changed, not visibly, but some swore it shimmered faintly from within, as if holding on to her presence, refusing to let her go entirely. No shrine was built, no priests were summoned. The grove remained wild, untouched by marble or doctrine, but the legend only deepened. And now, when the moon is full and the wind still, some say the swan returns to the lake, not to be seen, but to remember. Far from Sparta, in a valley cradled by wind and willow trees, another tale unfolded, not of gods and warriors, but of music. Millennium was not born under a palace roof, nor in the warmth of a divine prophecy. He was born beneath a storm-tossed sky, under a willow tree whose branches bowed like the backs of weary travelers. Thunder cracked the heavens when he entered the world, but he did not cry, he hummed. As a child, Melanian heard music where others heard noise. Streams whispered melodies when he drank from them. Leaves trembled in rhythm when he passed. By 10, he could mimic any bird's call and braid it into songs that lingered in the air long after the last note faded. By 16, he could draw tears from soldiers with a single chord. He never claimed to be divine, never wore laurels or sought temple gates. He walked from village to village, offering music without price. His voice calmed fevers. His harp stitched broken hearts. He once played for a dying child whose last breath came with a smile, cradled by a lullaby only the gods dared weep to. But not all who listened were mortal. One spring evening, as he sat beside a river and played a song about starlight and sorrow, the air changed, the water stilled, the frogs fell silent. The world seemed to lean in. From the shadows of the trees stepped 9 women, the muses, daughters of memory, keepers of inspiration. Each carried her own presence, tragedy, dance, epic, song, history. They did not speak, only listened. Then, to his astonishment, they sang back, 9 voices in perfect harmony, older than language, fuller than silence. Melania closed his eyes and joined them, his voice not echoing theirs, but expanding them. When the final note dissolved into the night, even the stars seemed closer. Calliope, the eldest, stepped forward. She touched his brow and whispered, "You are not ordinary. You are a vessel." From that night on, Melania was no longer just a bard. He was chosen, not to rule, but to carry beauty that mortals had forgotten how to hold. The muses led Melania to the folds of Mount Helicon, a place few dared to tread. Beneath its skies, untouched by mortal ambition, they taught him not with words, but with presence. Calliope, muse of epic, showed him how to bend stories into song. Clio whispered histories into his dreams, threading centuries of memory into melody. Terpsichore danced barefoot through the trees, and as she moved, Melanian's fingers followed her rhythm, learning the silent music of motion. Euterpe laid her flute in his hands and said only one word, "Listen," and he did, to the rustle of branches, to the hush before rain, to the sigh of breath held between two heartbeats. He listened until even silence became a symphony. They gave him no power, only perspective, the kind that lives in the moment between grief and acceptance, the kind mortals feel but rarely recognize. In return, the muses asked only this, that he sing not for them, but for the world, the broken, the proud, the forgotten, the longing. Let beauty be a bridge, not a crown. Melania obeyed. For a time, he became a bard, unlike any before. He played in city squares, in lonely fields, before kings and beggars alike. His songs stirred revolutions. His chords mended fathers to daughters. He made warriors lower their swords and weep without shame. But with every performance, something inside him began to shift. A hunger grew, not for applause, but for something beyond even the divine. He began chasing a melody he hadn't been taught, a final song buried somewhere beyond reach, a song that could still the wind and stretch time. He didn't share this quest with the muses. In secret, he composed by moonlight, in silence so heavy it made the stars blink. The melody came in fragments, in dreams, in thunder, in echoes that disappeared upon waking. He wasn't writing it, he was finding it, and once he believed he had found its beginning, he vanished from the world. Melania withdrew from cities, from fame, from the songs that had once made empires pause. He disappeared into the shadows of Mount Helicon, climbing farther than any mortal bard had ever dared. There, in a hidden cave, lined with crystal veins that shimmered like frozen starlight, he set to work, not composing, but unraveling something older than music. He barely slept. He ate only when hunger blurred his vision. Time twisted inside the cave. Sometimes weeks passed like days. Sometimes a single chord took a month to find. The song refused to obey him. It shifted with his breath, tangled with his heartbeat. It was not a melody. It was a truth, and it did not want to be tamed. Still, he continued. He played until his fingers bled, until his voice frayed, until tears rolled down his cheeks for reasons he couldn't name. When he finally played the last note, the world changed. Birds froze mid-flight, streams paused, clouds halted in their drift. Even the fates, who never looked away from their loom, stopped weaving and turned their heads. The gods heard it. Olympus stirred. Zeus set down his thunderbolt. Hades lifted his gaze from the underworld. The song asked nothing of them. It did not seek worship. It simply revealed. It was everything. Love and loss, life and decay. It held no answers, only understanding. The muses waited for Melania to return, to share what he had found. But he didn't. He buried the melody inside himself, not out of pride, or so he told himself, but to protect it. They won't understand, he whispered. They'll cheapen it. I'll keep it safe. The muses saw what he couldn't, that he was no longer a vessel. He was a vault, and beauty, when caged, begins to decay. They came to him one dusk, cloaked in sorrow. Erato, soft-voiced, said, "You were chosen to carry beauty." Cleo added, "But beauty is not meant to be hidden." Melanian shook his head. "They are not worthy of it." And so Calliope, who had once crowned his brow, said with a voice like wind over broken strings, "Then you are no longer ours." They vanished, and the song, once divine, began to rot inside him. Night fell like velvet over the cave mouth, and with it came a gentler hush than Melania had known in years. He lay back on cold stone, clutching the instrument that had once opened nations, and drifted into sleep with the stubborn comfort of a guardian. In the dream, the final song arrived, whole, bright as noon over the sea, soft as a mother's breath. He walked inside its light, every note a doorway, every chord a sky. Joy rose in him so swiftly he laughed, and the cave walls echoed with laughter that belonged to no one and everything at once. Dawn, he woke with tears on his face, and nothing in his hands but silence. He tried to hum the first phrase, and found only fog. Panic fluttered in his chest, then pecked, then clawed. He seized charcoal, scrawled frantic sigils on the floor, hunting a pattern that would not stand still. When the shapes failed him, he scraped them away until his fingers bled. By dusk, he had convinced himself he'd simply slept poorly, and so he lay down, certain he would trap the melody tomorrow. Tomorrow came obediently. The dream returned like a lover bearing forgiveness. Stronger, clearer, richer, a cathedral of sound in which even his doubts bowed. He sang along within sleep, mapping turns and steps, swearing he would wake at the crest and carry the crest into morning. Sunrise touched his eyelids. The cathedral vanished. Only dust motes remained, twirling in a beam of light. He opened his mouth, and grief poured out where music should have been. He sought allies against forgetting. Scribes lay beside him with wax tablets, waiting for the midnight tremor that changed the air. Seers painted sigils on his brow. He tied threads around his fingers, nodded to each remembered feeling. Night after night, the melody came to him immaculate. Night after night, the scribes heard nothing. The tablets kept their blank patience, and the knots untied themselves like water, leaving a fist. The curse was not cruel in noise. It was cruel in lack. Pride cracked, and something colder took its place. Not hatred, but possession turned to hunger. Melania stopped playing in public. He turned away from doorways, where listeners once waited with cupped hands. The muses watched from far off, eyes bright with rain they never let fall. He was given to carry, said one. He chose to keep, said another. Then the keeping shall be his burden, whispered the third, and the night tightened around his dreams like a ring. Seasons folded over Helicon, the bard's cheeks hollowed. His voice grew ragged from waking with a shout that always came too late. He smashed mirrors that reflected a stranger with his mouth half open, as if the man might still be singing in a world just to the left of this one. He strung and restrung his lyre until the strings sang only of strain. When villagers found him muttering to the wind, he asked them whether they had ever swallowed sunlight and then forgotten the taste. They pressed bread into his hands and fled. At last he left the mountain, not descending so much as unraveling down its sides. He wandered through markets, where once applause had spilled like grapes, now chasing echoes that hid in shutters and gutters. "Have you heard it?" he asked, a boy stacking jars, the song with no beginning and no end. The boy shook his head and watched the great Melanian step backward from the answer, as if it had struck him. That night the song returned, merciful as rain on ash, full, intact, a perfect circle. Morning found him on his knees, cupping silence as if it might spill. And still, each dusk, he chased sleep like a pilgrim who knows the shrine will open only in darkness. And still, each dawn, he woke with the shape of awe in his throat and no thread to pull. The world gave him pity. The gods gave him distance. The muses gave him absence. The song gave him everything, but only where memory could not follow. Melania no longer lived in the world others knew. His body remained thin as twilight, face lined like an old scroll, but his spirit wandered between waking and dreaming, always aching for the song he could only touch when the sun was gone. By now, few remembered him as the bard who once made kings weep and the gods lean forward. He was a ghost with a pulse, a shadow humming melodies no one else could hear. He stopped asking strangers to listen. He began speaking to trees, to fountains, to the firelight in empty inns. He believed that perhaps the song had hidden itself in the spaces between all things. One day, a child sang a nursery rhyme in the marketplace, and Melania gasped, certain it held a fragment. He followed the family for 2 villages before collapsing in the dirt, whispering to the boy to sing again. But the tune was simple and mortal, and the final song did not answer. In his dreams, the music still came, vast, unspoiled, luminous, and in those hours, he was whole. He danced inside harmony, spoke in chords, wept in key. But each time he woke, the melody vanished like breath from glass. The punishment was not silence, it was remembrance without recall. He knew something sacred had touched him. He just didn't know how to bring it back. The muses did not return. The gods stopped watching. But some said that, on windless nights, if you pressed your ear to Melanian's mouth while he slept, you could hear a song not made of words, but of longing. It trembled on the edge of the mortal world, just a fragment, just a breath. He wandered the coasts, drawn at last to the cliffs that overlooked the sea, a place so quiet even the wind forgot to speak. There he lay against a stone, the sea breeze threading through what remained of his hair. He did not sing, he did not weep, he simply closed his eyes, and the dream came one last time. But this time, it was different. He was no longer watching the song, he was in it. The notes bloomed around him like petals from a forgotten bloom. The sky above pulsed in rhythm. The sea below hummed in response. And Melanian's voice, unbroken and clear, joined the chorus not as visitor, but as origin. He saw then that the song had not been stolen. It had grown beyond him. He was not its author. He was its echo. And he finally let go. When morning came, the wind found his body still and quiet, his hands folded as if cradling an invisible lyre. A shepherd found him and said the old man looked peaceful, as though he'd just heard something worth dying for. There was no grave, no temple, no altar raised in his name, only the sea. Melania was buried beneath a single olive tree that stood alone at the edge of the cliff. There were no mourners, no rites read by priests, no crowds to sing his name, just the shepherd who found him, and a few villagers who remembered what it meant to be moved by a song you could not explain. They placed a stone over his resting place, not carved, not polished, just a marker to say, here was someone who had once carried something too beautiful to hold. Yet his legacy refused to stay silent. In the years that followed, strange things were whispered across the land. Travelers claimed that if you passed the cliff under a new moon, you might hear a single note in the wind, fleeting, aching, impossibly beautiful. Not a song, just enough of one to make you stop walking. Just enough to make you feel something deep in your chest that had no name. Children began dreaming of music they'd never heard. Musicians awoke in the middle of the night with tears on their cheeks, lyres in their hands, and no memory of what they'd played. Some bards claimed their fingers moved on their own for a few seconds, plucking a chord so perfect it hurt. And yet no one could remember it by morning. The muses remained silent. They issued no judgment, no warning. They did not reclaim the song, nor gift it again, because they understood something few mortals ever do, that some music is not meant to be shared, performed, or praised. Some music is meant to be felt, quietly, alone, in the spaces between breath and sleep. Melanian's punishment had not been cruelty. It had been refusal, the refusal to surrender something divine. And in the end, his redemption came not through performance, but through surrender. In letting go, he became part of the song. The final melody was never written down. It was never performed in amphitheaters or temples. It doesn't exist in scroll or scripture, but it lingers. It lives in the quiet moments before a performer plays their first note, in the hush between lightning and thunder, in the way the sea sounds different when you're grieving. It cannot be taught, only remembered in the soul, not the mind. And they say that if you find yourself standing alone on a cliff at night, with no one watching, and the wind is especially kind, you might hear it, just a fragment, just a breath. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, you'll understand why Melania never let it go. And if you've enjoyed this journey through forgotten myth, strange love, and divine memory, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. These are the stories we whisper into the dark, not to keep you awake, but to help you dream deeper. Sleep well.